Hello and welcome to Behind the Mask, Thriving in Healthcare, a podcast created for healthcare employees to explore not only issues relating to mental and emotional health, but also unique challenges that those working in healthcare are faced with. Your hosts are Adina Tucker, a licensed clinical social worker with Dartmouth Health, and Jennifer Hensey, an MSW also with Dartmouth Health. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about social media and cyberbullying. We're lucky to have Pam Bertolino back with us. And just a reminder, in case you haven't listened to our episode about tips for talking with your teen, Pam is an LICSW with 35 years of experience providing family therapy, and she is also a mother of 2 daughters. So we appreciate you joining us today to give us some advice and ways to approach these topics with our children. And, the concern with social media is that children and teens are exposed to a lot of things, and that's true with the internet in general. We have way less control over what our children consume and are exposed to than in the past due to the internet and social media. And one thing that can happen now is cyberbullying. Prior to the internet and social media, which I'm old enough to remember, someone might call you a name in school and you'd go home and that would be it. And now someone can call you a name online and then forward it to 10 friends who then text you and harass you. And I feel like it's almost created this situation where these kids don't get a reprieve from harassment if there's someone that's being targeted. And just to look at some research, according to Pew Research, nearly half of U.S. teens aged 13 to 17 report experiencing one of 6 cyberbullying behaviors. And the most commonly reported behavior is name calling. A smaller percentage report saying they've had false rumors spread about them online. And then an even smaller group reports being sent explicit images that they did not ask for. So, according to the research, older teens aged 15 to 17 report more sexually related bullying and stalking behaviors. Looking at some similar research from the National Institute of Health, those who reported experiencing cyberbullying were more likely to report suicidal thoughts or attempts versus those who didn't. So, to start off, research shows that more frequent and higher use of social media has been linked with increased symptoms of anxiety, depression, isolation, and hopelessness. It's also something that can become addictive. So, what have you seen in practice, and do you have any initial thoughts about all of this and how it affects our teens' mental health?
Yes, I have a lot of thoughts. I think, in general, teens have the rate of teen depression and anxiety has definitely increased. And I think that's, probably started with COVID, but it definitely has to do with social media also. And I think some of the most prevalent dangers are body image, online privacy and stalking, like you mentioned, cyberbullying, predators, and sexual content. And doctors have said that teens who use social media more than 3 hours a day face double the risk of anxiety and depression. And the average is 3.5 hours, according to the Surgeon General. So it's definitely an issue that's affecting our teens. And when people say, why do you think, there are so many mental health issues with teens nowadays? I think it's definitely a factor.
Really interesting. For sure, there's lots of concerns around teenagers and kids using social media. And Pam, I was really curious, you know, for as disconnected that social media also ironically kind of makes us, it also has had benefits for folks who are like differently abled or maybe isolated, being able to connect and forge at least some form of community online. But I was curious if there's any real benefits for teenagers specifically using social media.
Yes, I think there definitely is because, kids' job is to connect with people, to connect to their community and their friends and peers. So, social media is one of the ways to do that. It allows them to connect with people and to have a private space to do that. And one of the things I read said that social media can act as a connective tissue between the physical and emotional world for teens. So, yeah, I think there are definitely some positives, but of course, those need to be taken with a grain of salt. And also we need to look at the negatives too, and parents play a big role in that.
I think that's a great point, and that's also a really interesting way to think of it as like a connective tissue, but also to reinforce that it is important, obviously, to have balance, and probably that form of connection should not become the heart and soul of the connecting teens are doing online.
I think that makes, I will say with my own teenager, especially when he was younger, he had some, online friends through some of these games that they play. And it really was the only place where he said he felt like he was accepted for being himself. And I think even if you look at even further, teens or adolescents that are in rural areas, especially like who are LGBTQ, and maybe they're very isolated and having people like them, there is something to be said for having that. And I like the idea of it being called connective tissue, to be almost like a lifeline to having someone who understands them. But kind of, and that's kind of where I've always gone back and forth, is knowing that for my child, it felt like a connection, but also seeing, some concerning things at times. What do you feel like is the line between monitoring for safety and like appropriate use, and like prying or snooping that would maybe damage your relationship with your child? And do you feel like that's like an age based thing? And like at a certain age, you need to just not worry about that at all? Or I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I'm not sure if I guess it is an age-based thing because, according to the Academy of American Pediatrics, they don't think that kids should have social media until about the age of 13. Now, I don't know if that's realistic or not, but that's what they recommend. So just in terms of, parents keeping track of things, I think you have to use a multi-pronged approach. Definitely time limits. I mean, kids should have time limits on how much they use social media or their phones. A lot of people take away the phones at bedtime because kids will just go to sleep with them next to them and can get texts all night and they don't sleep. Another way to do that is to make sure that tablets, computers, and phones are in a common area. Keep them out of private spaces. No tablets or computers or phones in bedrooms. Have them be in the kitchen, someplace where you can watch them. And also, I think it's important to get online family protection, the parent apps that kind of monitor for things. I think that's also really important. And, another thing that I did when my kids were younger, actually, I still do it, is I get onto their social medias. I join, tell them that that's a requirement so that I can kind of monitor what they're doing. Now, obviously, they can have fake pages that I know nothing about, but, I feel like at least it's one way to kind of monitor what's going on.
Yeah, those are great tips on setting those sorts of clear boundaries with teens and adolescents. But I was curious what you would recommend to parents who, they're doing great on setting the boundaries, having the phones be put up at night, maybe having access to your kid's social media page if they're going to have one. But what's a good way for parents to respond if their teenager tells them, you know, that they feel left out or out of touch with their peers if they can't use social media as frequently as their friends do?
Well, I think that's one of those things that kids say about everything. Like, my friends can do this, or my friends don't have to make their bed, and I do. So I
Yeah.
think I would use the same kind of logic
Hmm.
with that and say, yeah, that may be, that, you can't use it as much as your friends do, but this is what, in this home, this is what we feel is appropriate. And then you could offer to do things like play dates, or let's find another way for you to connect with your friends. Why don't you have them over and you can play soccer in the yard, or excuse me, we can have a pizza night or a movie night or something like that. I mean, if that's truly the issue, which it probably isn't, it's probably just that they want to do what their friends are doing, then I would offer them other suggestions if you are concerned that it's, interfering with their connection with friends.
As far as, like boundaries or parameters that we can teach kids just in life, but as far as making it go to social media, like for instance, my my boyfriend's daughter, I don't know why she does this, but I thought it was interesting. She doesn't accept friend requests from people that go to her school on like she just uses it, some of these apps for entertainment and she just, is very private that way. And I thought to myself, like that's actually a really good boundary, especially knowing that kids can, be mean for no reason. But are there any boundaries that you think are important for us to teach our kids in terms of like how they behave on social media or what they do in order to maybe protect themselves from things like bullying from classmates or, you know, creepy people on the internet?
Yeah, I actually also agree with that approach. I think your boyfriend's daughter is really smart for doing that. I think that kind of prevents a lot of problems that could potentially happen. So I like that idea. Things for us to do as parents is to model healthy social media use. I mean, I notice myself looking at my phone, several times a day when I'm not doing other things, and it's probably not a good habit. And, I think it can lead toward addiction. And so we want our kids to kind of do what we're doing. So we probably should monitor that for ourselves.
I think that's great. I wanted to ask about the other risks involved in terms of adverse health effects of social media use in teens. I know we're going to touch on bullying some more, but when it comes to things like forming an addiction or habitual use of a phone or a computer or gaming or whatever it could be, social media wise with kids.
Yeah, I think, one of them is body image. And I think kids are, often looking at, girls, well, boys too, what they're seeing on social media and comparing themselves to it. And if they don't measure up, I think they can potentially, go down the hole of decreased self-esteem and which could lead to eating disorders and that type of thing.
That was a great point.
So the side effects of social media, besides bullying, which is a big one, is, kids tend to perform poorly in school if they're online all the time because they're not doing their homework and they're not really attending to it. If they have the phone in one hand and they're looking at their homework, on the other hand, it's much more fun to look at your phone. Another adverse effect is isolation. Kids can become more isolated. They're not going out as much. They're not planning activities because they can just talk to their friends online or on the phone or whatever it is. Poor sleep. I mentioned before that, some kids have their phones next to them in bed. And so if they're getting text all night, they're not sleeping. And anxiety, depression, self-harming, suicidal thoughts, all of those things are at a higher risk when kids are using social media too much or maybe using it as a substitute for socializing.
I think it was very interesting that one of the first things you said was body image because I feel like there could be an entire episode on how body image and social media, not just teens, but also women in general, especially women who are in relationships. There could be a whole thing about body image, but that especially is concerning with adolescents and teens because it's such an awkward age. And the research that I was looking at, it was saying that someone's appearance was one of the most common reasons why someone got teased or bullied online was something about their appearance. So it's super interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the bullying because I feel like that's every parent's kind of worry, one of the worries. So, are there any warning signs or things that we should look out for that might signal that maybe our child is being bullied?
I think it's, the same things that we'd look out for, with mental health issues. If the child is more withdrawn, they're isolating more, they seem more irritable, they seem sad, those kinds of things. If their behavior is different than it usually is for them, those are the key warning signs, I think. And then there are a bunch of things that parents can do if, we can talk about that further.
It's interesting because I think about how, prior to all of this connectivity and social media, when you had to face your bullies, it was at school. right? So this very set, determined time period of day for the most part. But now, with kids being so highly connected, that bullying can be, and they can encounter that all hours, right? Even when they go home, there's no real refuge anymore, so long as they've got the phone or the whatever connected to them. And I was curious, what would you tell a parent who had to face a harsh realization that maybe their child is the one who is a bully?
Yeah, I mean, that's hard. When I was looking into this, one of the things I found is that Boston Children's Hospital actually has a bullying clinic, which I thought was kind of fascinating. When your child is the bully, I think that's what you asked. The first challenge would be to accept it, because I think that's a hard thing to accept about your kid. Oftentimes the kids can be popular, good looking, adults think they're role models, all that kind of thing. And a big myth is that bullies are rough and tough and full of insecurities, but that's not always the case. So I think the first challenge is just believing that your child is a bully. The next thing would be trying to get the kid to talk about their behavior. And, they can become defiant, roll their eyes, refuse to answer, that, deny that it's bullying or that the other kid deserves it. And many parents don't know what to do, but the research shows that punishing doesn't work. Um, so grounding, suspension, those kinds of things don't work. And it could end the bullying for a little bit, but then it starts up again, and sometimes it could be even worse. So at the clinic at Boston Children's, they recommend a therapeutic rather than a punitive approach. So, you know, we could look at what motivates the bullying. So it might be a need to be, top dog at school or in the social circle. It could be decreased self-esteem. They might pick on kids that are perceived as weak. And kids who bully feel like they have more power and they use bullying to maintain it. Sometimes bullies, and this is not to stereotype, can have, neurodevelopment problems like ADD, ADHD, things like that. And they can have trouble handling frustration and controlling their impulses. They could have problems at home. Parents could be bullying each other, or there could be physical violence, and that's what they see. And they repeat this behavior. So I think for parents, they sort of have to accept that their kid is a bully and talk to them, teach empathy, consider neurological evaluation, and then address issues at home. There could be abuse at home or, among siblings that the parents aren't even aware of.
Well, really good points. And it's super interesting. There's a bullying clinic, which it makes sense though. And it makes sense to me that punishment wouldn't help either. Because bullying is one of those things where it's like you're doing something to harm someone else. So it's a little more complicated than, playing on your video game past curfew or something. I'm curious, just kind of as an offset of this, I feel like one of the things with social media that seems to have changed to me is this whole idea, kind of like a loss of empathy at times, almost like this is behind a computer screen, so it's not real. Like I'm just having a good time and being funny and making people laugh, but I'm not actually doing anything. Do you think that our kids have become less empathetic or desensitized to how things affect other people because of social media and the internet?
Yeah, I really do. One of the things that I was looking at that Boston Children's recommends is teaching your kids empathy and what it is. So I don't remember ever having, to be taught that at a young age. So I think it does take away from that. And I think, we're kind of, you know, no one knows who's doing what. And sometimes people use fake names or things like that. So yeah, I think people can get away with a whole lot. And they don't really realize, or maybe they don't believe that they're could be causing serious distress, anxiety, depression, or anything like that for another kid, because they may be experiencing it themselves, and that's why they're bullying.
I really think that's a great point about what happens to empathy and the growth of it or the lack of growth of it when it comes to kids and frequent use of social media. And it kind of reminds me of some research I read about just in young child, I know we're talking about teenagers here, but even in just younger children like babies, toddlers, the experience that they get staring at a screen, conversing with a loved one is still very passive, received in a very passive way through their brain rather than that direct face to face in real life, in real time interaction with another human being. And I think about how kids nowadays, just going out into public, if they're riding public transportation or really just, you can imagine any setting. It used to be, you might see strangers talking to one another. You might see people just observing things as they are. And then as a kid, looking around, making observations of what's going on around them. But it seems more often than not, the adults that they're observing are looking at phones and not actually having human connection or interaction. And I think that just speaks a lot to the lack of empathy that is created, or well, not being created, because there's a lot less human connection taking place all around.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I notice it myself, if I'm not doing something, I'm picking up my phone to check emails or see what's happening or
Yeah.
looking at the news or whatever. And it's not something that we used to do. So like if you weren't doing that, maybe you'd make a
Hmm.
phone call and check in with a friend or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I feel like people don't even talk on the phone anymore. I remember being in middle and high school, and I feel like there's also this weird aspect of it where it's like, I think about this a lot where, people or my children will send a text and it's like they expect you to reply like immediately, or, their friend. And it's like, used to, if I wanted to talk to somebody when I was in middle school, I'd call and either someone in their house would answer and they may or may not tell that person I called, or I'd have to leave a message. And I don't know if I'd ever hear back from them. It would just depend if the stars aligned. And it's like, now it's like immediate, immediate, immediate. And,
Mm.
Even talking on the phone, like, I feel like that's something that not a lot of teens do anymore, which I guess maybe they use video calls more now. So I don't know, but it does seem like there's a lot of social skills that have been lost, and for sure the empathy. I guess my last question would be, if you do find out, if your teen does come to you or you find out they're being bullied, aside from maybe getting them some therapy to kind of help, are there any things that you could do as a parent that can maybe help or just be supportive?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is to make sure they're safe because, some of this bullying it can be very violent and, physically or emotionally. And make sure you're giving them unconditional support. You want to talk with them, listen to them, and you want to really do that in a calm manner if you can, because I think it's very upsetting to parents. So our, natural reaction might be to yell or say, "What? I can't believe that's happening. I'm gonna, go talk to those parents or whatever." But you really have to try and listen with a calm ear and find out exactly what did happen. And don't minimize or make excuses for the aggressor, and ask the child what they'd like to see happen at this point. And then, there's a whole list of things you can do. You could collect evidence, get screenshots, shots, recordings, pictures, those kinds of things. And also work with the school if it's happening at school, because all schools have a anti-bullying policy. Another thing that I thought was really interesting that I read is that you should try and refrain from contacting the parents of the aggressor. And that's sort of like the first thing I would have expected. I feel like when I was a kid, the parents would talk to the parents and that's how they would resolve things. But the recommendation is to not do that because the parents may become really defensive and, they might become more antagonistic instead of gracious, and then the bullying will get even worse. And the other thing that I thought was another good recommendation is to contact the content provider. So who the internet provider or whoever, for whichever media source it is, because cyberbullying violates the terms of legitimate service providers. So there's a way that they can shut that down. And there's also a place that you can call called cyberbullying.org to report it. So that's another Oh, there's another agency too that I wanted to mention. The US Department of Health and Human Services has a hotline, Stop Bullying Now, and it's 24/7, and that number is 1-800-273-8255. So maybe just to have that handy or in a place that kids might see it. And then just to get back to what parents can do, if necessary, the kid maybe needs to have some counseling. If bullying is based on race, sex, disability, sexual orientation, something like that, they might have to report it to, a civil rights organization because it might go against a disability law. You could also contact the police and, set up privacy contracts on your devices so that it doesn't continue to reoccur.
Those are excellent tips, and I really appreciate you giving that number as well. So, Pam, can you tell us what are the warning signs of social media addiction that parents might see in their teenagers?
Well, I think the biggest one is that they always feel a need to be online. And if they try to decrease that, they really begin to get restless and irritable, almost like, well, it is exactly like other addictions with drugs or alcohol. And, they experience anxiety or depression when they're not using social media. Or if you feel like they're using social media to escape reality or to numb their emotion, just like alcohol or drugs. Kids can do that just to like zone out. So as with any addiction, it's kind of measured on the impact and how much a person has to use it to control their urges and triggers and things like that. Another thing that I saw was really interesting is that when kids use social media or when anyone uses social media, it triggers the brain's reward system and it causes a release of dopamine, which is the feel-good brain chemical. So when a person uses social media, they get a surge of dopamine and then they crave more of it and they crave more of it like a drug. So that's something just to be aware of too. And social media algorithms are programmed to do that so that people do become addicted to it.
So, a really close friend of mine uses, I think it's something on her iPhone where you can set limits. And after a certain amount of time, it will lock any sort of social media apps. So she gives herself like so much time a day so that she doesn't go over. And I know that I have the thing on mine where it will tell me how much time I've spent on my phone each day. And it is shocking. So I'm always super excited when it's like, your phone usage just gone down and it was only 3 hours today. And I'm like, look at me not being on my
Yep.
phone.
As you're saying that, I was thinking, I also saw there are certain apps to really be concerned about. And I just wanted to mention those. One is Badoo. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but BADOO, monkey, HILY, HILY, plenty of fish, and then hot or not. And these apps are especially dangerous because they register people's phone's location. So predators can find people when they're using those. Yeah, I mean, I think there's the risk with all of them, but those ones in particular were mentioned as pretty dangerous.
There's a couple of apps that I have used in the past. One of them is Bark. I can't remember the name of the other one, but you can certainly Google. But the one thing about some of these apps that I liked is that because I was concerned about being a privacy issue, but it will literally scan chats for anything that indicates bullying or suicide, self harm, drug use, and it will send you a screenshot of just that piece of it so that you can kind of be aware if someone's texting your child something inappropriate or whatever. I think it also screens pictures for being inappropriate as well. But I used that for a while because I was just like, I don't want to go through your stuff all the time because I feel like I do want to give you some privacy. But at the same time, I'd be nervous about what's going on the internets. Are there any closing thoughts as we wrap up? Well, thank you, Pam, for joining us again. This was super helpful as always. And I know we have like a couple of other topics that we want to bring you back for your opinion on. If you can be convinced. But hopefully this was very helpful. Thank you for joining us this week. As always, if you'd like more information and support, please check out our site at dartmouth-health.cobalt.care for additional content, connection to resources, support groups that you can sign up to attend, or to connect to one of our clinicians for counseling, psychotherapy, or medication evaluation. We appreciate you listening and hope you have a wonderful week.